From the far reaches of the Milky Way galaxy, it's Retro Nerd Girl with a film review for you. Today, I'll be reviewing the movie The Time Machine, released in 1960. Starring Rod Taylor, Alan Young, and Yvette Mimuse. The synopsis is, a man's vision for a utopian society is disillusioned when traveling forward into time reveals a very bleak future. The story. This film is an adaptation of a science fiction novella by H.G. Wells, published in 1895 of the same name. H.G. Wells was a futurist who wrote about aircrafts, tanks, space travel, nuclear weapons, satellite television, and the internet, well before any of these things were invented. H.G. Wells is often called the father of science fiction, along with Jules Verne, the Shakespeare of science fiction, and his book was the first known use of the term time machine, referring to a time-traveling device in which one can travel to the future or the past. Some of his most famous works are The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The War of the Worlds, and The First Men on the Moon. He originally explored the concept of time travel in his short story, The Chronic Argonauts, in 1888, published in his college newspaper. Over the years prior to the film, the book grew as a classic science fiction literary work and became a staple of study, thus making it a subject in pop culture. However, it wouldn't be long before it would be adapted into a feature film. George Pal, a Hungarian-American animator, film director, and producer, became famous for short stop-motion animated films initially. Later in his career, he pushed the limits of special effects by producing films such as Destination Moon in 1950, When Worlds Collide in 1951, War of the Worlds in 1953, Houdini in 1953, Naked Jungle in 1954, Conquest of Space in 1955, The Big Fun Carnival in 1957, and Tom Thumb in 1958. Tom Thumb was actually his first directorial feature film. After successfully producing The War of the Worlds, which was also adapted from another H.G. Wells novel, H.G. Wells' son, Frank Wells, talked with George Pal about making an adaptation of The Time Machine. George couldn't get any studios in Hollywood to greenlight the film for a while, but after much effort, he found that MGM's British studio, where George filmed Tom Thumb, was his way in to make the film. Interestingly enough, the film was shot on MGM's lot in the United States. At the surface, when I first saw this as a kid in the 1980s, I thought it was just a cool action-adventure film with lots of schlock. I had no idea that the film had so much more to it and has a lot of significant undertones and messages. At the core of it, it's a time travel movie, which isn't my favorite movie genre because, in my opinion, time travel is so messy. I could go on and on about it, but it's so interesting that many of my favorite movies have time travel in it, such as The Terminator, released in 1984, and Predestination, released in 2014, just to name a few. I'm always surprised when I see these stories that actually dissuade my disbelief and I can have fun with them. Many would say that the book is better than the film, but I'd also like to appreciate the fact that this film introduced many people to the book throughout the decades. Now the pacing. At an hour and 43 minutes, it's short and sweet, which really worked well for the storytelling. No complaints from me there. Now, the challenge and the empathy. Typically, I keep these two sections separately, but in this story, I feel as if the challenge stems from the protagonist, so I'll be talking about the two together. So to set up the movie, aristocratic scientists are meeting at a man's home at his request for dinner, but he's running late. He arrives, but disheveled and sits down to tell his story. In the book, this man is just called the time traveler, and the story is actually being told by a narrator who is one of the men at this dinner. In a way, you can say that this is a second-hand story. A story of a story. And I always thought that was cool. But that also brings to mind the idea that since this is a retelling, maybe some of the facts have been compromised. And I kind of like that idea. In a way, it makes it feel more real that the events that we're seeing play out in the movie are possibly exaggerated. In this movie, the time traveler's name is George Wells, paying homage to H.G. Wells and the director George Pal. George's telling flashes back to a week prior, where the privileged intellectuals gathered as they do weekly to discuss advancements in science. George gloats over his new invention, exploring the fourth dimension of time. But even with a miniature demonstration, his friends do not believe him, nor do they see the practical or profitable use for time travel. At first, it seems that he's really frustrated by his peers because they're closed-minded, but then you realize that there's more as he speaks privately to his friend David Philby, who is presumably the narrator in the book. David is actually very fearful of the time machine and doesn't want to, what he calls, tempt Providence. David is a good friend, but he doesn't quite understand why George wants to travel through time. In a way, David is a slave to his responsibilities of the Victorian age, so much to the point that he eventually ends up dying in World War I, which might have been George's doomed fate as well. George reveals that he doesn't care too much for the time that he's born into. He thinks he's ahead of his time. As well, he criticizes the current society's obsession with war and money. When he travels to the future, he sees that his criticisms of society are quite valid, as it leads to a world ravaged by wars, reduced to a primitive state, and mankind is split off into two mutations, the Eloi and the Morlocks. This twist to the story in the book was heavily based on H.G. Wells's childhood, as his mother was a servant living in the basement of her employer's home and suffered health issues. He too began his early life in unhappy apprenticeships as a teen, having to work in basements before he became a writer. In many of these jobs, people would spend their entire lives living underground, in tunnels, suffering horrible health conditions. This was the inspiration for what a proposed evolution of classism would create. The Morlocks are the descendants of the servants of the rich and industrial workers who lived underground. Somehow, over time, they began harvesting the Eloi for food. This is terribly disappointing to George when he realizes that the utopia that he was hoping for is actually a horrible dystopia. There are lots of movies that explore ideas of a future world that are very similar to this. One type of utopian society was detailed in Things to Come, released in 1939, and I think that was the future that George wanted to visit, although it was not without its problems. In Metropolis, released in 1929, there was a similar premise to the time machine, where we have the rich enjoying the city above ground and the workers that run the city were the poor underdwellers. In the film Zardoz, released in 1974, where we have exterminators, brutals, and eternals. This was another example of a separation of people into different economic groups that occurred over hundreds of years after an apocalypse. In the case of this movie, both the Eloi and the Morlocks have really lost touch with their humanity, not just mentally but physically. In the case of the Morlocks, you could even argue that they're not even really human anymore because they appear to be monstrous and a physical symbol of the lack of humanity that has led them into the willingness to commit cannibalism. They don't see any kinship with the Eloi. H.G. Wells may have gotten the name Morlocks from two sources. One is a Canaanite god, Moloch, associated with child sacrifice, also featured in the film Metropolis in 1929. The name Morlock may also be a play on the term for Molochs, referring to what miners in the olden days might have called themselves. The story also features Wells's political views about the industrial boom and the fear that future generations of the rich would abandon books, which could lead to the degradation of critical thinking. The Eloi are the result. H.G. Wells may have gotten the name Eloi from the Hebrew word Elohim, and I could be pronouncing that wrong, referring to gods in the Old Testament. The Eloi resemble humans for the most part, but they have been reduced to an illiterate, apathetic, and extremely docile food source for the Morlock. Because the Morlocks feed them and clothe them, their sense of curiosity and ambition has atrophied. It's easy to see how they got into this position over time. When George arrives 800,000 years into the future, he first sees the Eloi in what looks like to be the Garden of Eden, or a Garden of Eden. But a young girl by the name of Weena is drowning in a very populated river, and yet no one has made any effort to help her. And I actually have some theories on that, but it was a great demonstration of how the Eloi are truly apathetic. Naturally, George saves her, and as a result, she grows attached to him. Now, my theory is that Weena was actually faking her peril in order to find a mate. I know in the book, the Eloi appear to look like small children, and Weena becomes the time traveler's surrogate daughter in a way. There's no romantic relationship. And in the movie, Weena is more like a love interest, and I think that's part of like a mating ritual that they may have had. And if you look at some of the Eloi in the background, you can see that there is some sort of coupling going on. They're usually like two of them hanging out together. So that was very interesting to me. One other little piece of detail that I found very interesting was that while she was drowning, she reaches a rock and she puts her hand up to two men that are sitting on that rock, and they just simply look at her without interest. And I think they don't help her because it would mean that they would be committing into a relationship. And I could be wrong, but that moment always stood out to me because she is so attached to George after he saves her. I also noticed that when she's rejected by them, she swims away. It looks like she swims away. I'm like, wait a minute, you can swim? So it's just a subtle thing I noticed, and if you look at the footage, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, as a relationship, it may be a little creepy to some because the character of Weena looks so young compared to George. Weena is also very simple-minded, and George has to teach her so much. And I could see George eventually feeling alone in this world without someone to relate to. And I suppose that's why George eventually decides to go back to his time in the past. While in the future, though, George takes on a very fatherly disposition with all of the Eloi, eventually inspiring them to fight back against the Morlocks. It's very interesting because at first they are very apathetic, but after seeing how George is so emotional about the state of the way they live, it could be that they bond with him enough through those emotions. And ultimately, it's also possible that as their father figure, they just want to do things that might impress him. If you look at the footage, I'm reading so much into this, but when I look at the footage of the characters and their subtle movements, maybe it wasn't written necessarily in the script or the book, but maybe it was something that the actors developed amongst themselves. You can see it looks like they're trying to impress George. And that's what I like about it. There are a lot of subtle nuances in the performance of the actors that maybe I'm reading into it quite a bit, but I love that. I love the idea that there could be something more to all of this. The Morlocks and the Eloi are both slaves to their outcome. The Morlocks couldn't help what they had become, and it seems as if H.G. Wells ends up siding with the Eloi, the descendants of the rich aristocrats. But maybe H.G. Wells feels as if the Eloi were the ones that were the most human-like and the best hope for extending the lifespan of the human race. The possibility of humans even existing another 800,000 years is what we hope, but possibly unlikely without some kind of intervention or provisions, and no one's really planning that far ahead. George has found a new purpose to be the savior of this future world. And it's a very interesting choice because many people would think, wouldn't it be better for him to stay in his own time and stop the war from happening? Save some lives, or try to figure out a way to create an impact on society to keep the future of mankind whole. And my theory is that I think George feels as if the people of his time are too stubborn to change. After telling his story and having it go over so poorly with his friends, he just sees that his only chance to save mankind is to go, wait for it, Back to the Future. To build a new civilization. And look, that, you know, he's going back to the future, to a place where he's already being idolized and people are looking up to him and people are taking his ideas and actually acting upon it. So I think he feels like he's going to be more effective in the future. It sounds very promising, but the book has a much more pessimistic outcome for the human race. You know, in the book, the time traveler goes even further into the future, only to find out that humanity is completely gone before he goes back to his own time. On the final trip to the future, George takes 3 books. And they don't tell you which 3 books, and I think wisely, they kind of leave the audience to wonder what were the 3 books. And it's up to us to decide. And it actually creates an interactive experience to enjoy the movie well after it's over. Love it. Now, the technical aspects. Many modern reviewers make note of how simple and even cheesy the production was compared to the effects given for science fiction today. There's a big difference with over 60 years of advancement in the field. However, I can assure you that this was one of the greats of its time, breaking new ground to the point that Gene Warren and Tim Barr received the Academy Award for Best Special Effects for this movie. It was a wonder when you consider that the film was made with a total budget of only $75,000. That was incredible. For such a low-budget film, and a lot of costs were actually subverted. From May 25th to June 30th, 1959, the film was shot at MGM Studios lot in Culver City, California, to save money, acting as a Victorian age England. Many matte paintings and miniature models were used creatively to build out the look of the period. Time-lapse visuals were vastly used with stop-motion work. For instance, a time-lapse of a growing apple was actually stop-motion capture of painted during the stages of growth by artist Bill Brace, 1 frame at a time. In another scene, there were really cool ooey-gooey time-lapses of a decomposing Morlock, which was achieved by melting a wax figure and speeding up the footage. Many costumes and set pieces were also recycled from Forbidden Planet, which was released in 1956. Footage from George Pal's other movies, When Worlds Collide and War of the Worlds, was added to plump up the visuals. In the time travel sequence where atomic bomb set off a fictitious volcano in London, the molten lava was actually oatmeal colored with orange and red food coloring oozing through a miniature set. They were so creative. They also found a simple loophole to eliminate thousands of years of time travel visuals by trapping George inside of a cooled lava rock. Today, you might look at the Morlocks and think, wow, those costumes were a little hokey. But actually, for the time, it was shocking, scary, and delivered the impact that they needed to have in 1960. In my opinion, they were very impressive. I especially loved the light-up glowing eye effect. Sadly though, the white hair that was used for the wigs and costumes of the Morlocks were from colobus monkey hair. Today there are more fake hair and fur options for such costumes, but at the time the choices were limited, and I also think that they didn't care. Animal fur was socially acceptable then. The actor who played George Rod Taylor was under 6 feet tall, and the filmmakers wanted him to look imposing against the future humans. So in order to do that, they hired supporting actors that were shorter than George. The actors playing the Morlocks were also professional wrestlers, using all of the ring performing techniques on screen to convey a real threat for George. Now let's talk about that beautiful time machine, the key centerpiece to this whole production. George Pal wanted it to look like a sled, appealing to young boys of the time period. And it worked. The design of the time machine was quite a spectacular item in its day. It had a very Victorian retro shiny look to it, adorned with a plaque on the control panel that said that it was manufactured by H. George Wells. And I think it's one of the more memorable pieces, and I really like that a lot. It was a very nice touch in the film. It was such an iconic prop that it was sold at the MGM Studio auction in 1971, the same auction that originally sold the ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz, released in 1939. It was found in a thrift store in Orange, California 5 years later by film historian Bob Burns, who bought it for just $1,000. When he got the blueprints from his friend George Pal, he restored it for exhibition and special appearances, such as the Inventors Convention scene in Gremlins that was released in 1984. The production was topped off by an exciting score that was so grand and thrilling by Russell Garcia. In some parts it was dreamy and tender, and at times really inspired the mood of suspense. Now the performances. Australian actor Rod Taylor beat out David Niven and James Mason for the role of George. I felt that Rod is a clear standout in the role, giving the character an athletic, idealistic dimension. It was Rod Taylor's first leading role in a major film, and it was a wonderful performance. There's something about the way he sits in the time machine for the first time, very dreamy-eyed, with a sense of wonder and curiosity, as if you can see him dreaming out loud about the possibilities, where he would go and what he would see. All of George's emotions were written all over Rob's face as he explores how to operate the machine. He looks just like a kid playing with a new toy, and perhaps that's why, even though he's arrogant in the beginning of the film, he seems to have something that makes you identify with his curiosity. Now the enjoyment. The film had fairly good reviews and did very well at the box office, with a nomination for the 1961 Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, and of course, as I mentioned before, the Academy Award that it won for special effects. George Pal had planned to do a sequel to this film and submitted several scripts that were rejected by MGM. And just thinking about it, can you actually imagine a sequel to this movie? I would have loved to have seen that movie, and I'm always curious about what happened to George on his trip back to the future. Like, what happened there? And speaking of Back to the Future, the film of the same name, released in 1985, was heavily influenced by this film. And you can see that by the opening time sequence featured many floating clocks in a very similar manner in that movie. Now, I really wanted to talk about this. In 2002, The Time Machine was remade, starring Guy Pearce as a time traveler. The film was directed by Wells's great-grandson, Simon Wells, who I thought did a fantastic job. But the tragedy is that most people were expecting him to stay true to his grandfather's book, but instead he offered another take on the movie with a completely different commentary. And it was interesting, but it may have served the movie better to have a different name, just so it didn't have to live up to the legacy of the book or the 1960 movie version. But back to this movie. I find it a fascinating imagining of the world of the future. And if you read the book, you get the deeper meanings. The film does offer you these deeper meanings, but it doesn't spell it out for the audience. So it's left in as undertones. So perhaps you can consider this as a future world as an exaggeration of what H.G. Wells experienced in the Victorian age. And surely we can see many shadows of that in our present day. It's something to think about. But what I like about the movie, it doesn't tell you anything. So you're just looking at an action-adventure story. It's really awesome. And you have no idea that there's like any of this other socio-political stuff that's going on in the film. The ending actually is quite fascinating. It especially leaves you wondering what else happened after George makes his final trip. As I mentioned before, it's a great hallmark of an impactful film. You get your ending for this chapter, but there's clearly more to the story. What if, by sharing his story, whether anyone believes it or not, George changes the future to the point that when he gets back to the future, it's not there anymore, or it has been completely transformed? I love that possibility. And that's what I really like about this. It's a fantastic adventure and an exploration of ideas about war, the importance of education, and the pursuit of progress and science and knowledge. It also touches on the dangers of apathy, the needless destruction of war, and the social commentary about the dangers of the separation of economic classes. These are all conversations that are still valid today. My rating is a 9.4. Well, that sums up my review. I hope you liked it, and if you did, I've got over 100 of these videos, so go on and browse the channel to see more reviews from me like this. Subscribe if you haven't done so already, and hit the bell icon to be the very first to be notified of my next video. This is Retro Nerd Girl signing off. Take care, movie lovers. I'm off to my next review.